And thank you to all the participants, especially the ones that are working and were able to dial in on this beautiful summer day. This is the first of the FDAAA Alumni Association virtual speaker series. Hopefully we can do more of these to bring the members together across the country. And for the first presenter, we have a very esteemed guest, Dr. Luciana Borio. I had the pleasure of working with her, even though it was very brief, during the first Ebola patient that made it to the US. We were both working at FDA at the time. Just to set up the logistics of the call for today, we're going to start with a casual chat with Dr. Borio to get her thoughts and some latest developments, trends, what's on her mind. We've put some questions together to drive the conversation that we think would be of interest to the members on the call. And if there's time at the end, we'll open up the conversation for questions that you might have from the group. For those questions, just to keep the conversation flowing, if you could send those over to Angela. She's listed as one of the panelists. She'll collate them, and if there's time at the end, we'll ask Dr. Borio to respond. With that, if I could ask Dr. Borio to give a little background about herself, education, training, your work at FDA, your work at the White House, where are you now, and especially those that are COVID related. And I'm personally a little bit more interested also hearing about your work at your current position and anything you can share in that space.
That's great. Thank you so much, Sahil, and thank you, Lisa and Angela, for inviting me for this very special event. You know, it's like family, so it's like the toughest crowd and the friendliest crowd. So, and there's a lot of smart people online, and I saw a few of you already as you're dialing in, so it's great to see everybody. So I'm Lou, please call me Lou, and yeah, I spent several years at the FDA, which is I still hold in the best time of my professional career so far. I am a physician trained in infectious diseases and critical care medicine. I spent a lot of my career dedicated to biodefense, whether naturally occurring or deliberate threats. And I joined FDA around 2008 as a reviewer in CBER doing vaccine work. And shortly after, I moved to the commissioner's office to help support the response to the 2009 H1N1 pandemic flu. Most people don't even remember that we had a pandemic in 2009, but we did. And from commissioner's office, I held several positions, and then eventually as acting chief scientist. And in 2017, I was asked to join the National Security Council staff to direct medical and biodefense preparedness in the new administration. And that's where I spent the last couple of years of my federal service before leaving to work at InQtel. My present job is InQtel, IQT, and it's a very different from any other job that I've done before in the federal service. Basically, it's a non-for-profit strategic investor, like a venture capital, but non-for-profit, whose mission is to identify and fund technologies that are of interest to national security. So our main customer is the CIA. And within IQT, there's a small practice focused on biology and biotechnology. And we looked for biotech applications to national security, but also technologies that can help support biodefense activities. And that's my current job. It's a lot of fun to work in this intersection of science, biology, and national security.
And any thoughts, Lou, on where we are with COVID now, and any recent high-level findings that you can share with us? Just what your general sense is, where we are.
Yeah. So I think it's, we need to, as Tony Fauci says, there's no way to sugarcoat it, right? Like, look at the numbers, and there's just no way to make them look good. I mean, we have, as of today, the US has 4.85 million cases reported and 160,000 deaths. And, this is about a quarter of the global cases. And we are about 45% of the global population. So there's just no way to to find a way to explain the story. So we really have not, we have failed to respond in any cogent fashion. And I think that, I think it's in a way very perplexing, given that we are a country with so much creativity and so much technology and such incredibly dedicated, smart, talented people all over the country. But I think really demonstrates the importance of actually having very strong leadership and the role of the federal government as serving that role to bring those assets together in a organized fashion. So I think it's surprising to a lot of people. And I think that in addition to, the relative absence of a strong federal leadership, I think we're living in a very polarized society. So normally, when society is faced with an external shock like this or a common threat, it unites and it comes together to address it. And in this instance, there's been a polarization where even the idea of wearing masks or taking some public health measures have become the subject of contentious topics. And third, I would say that is concerning is like this anti-science sentiment. There's a lot of anti-science sentiment, and that we see every day in whether to trust public health guidance. On a personal level, what's I've been most surprised about, though, has been reputable scientists from reputable, academic medical centers promoting some bad ideas or relying on thoughts and practices that are frankly quite outdated. And you remember, Sahel, like in 2014, that during the Ebola epidemic in West Africa, the US really was very instrumental in helping organize the clinical trials in West Africa to support vaccine development and therapeutic development. It wasn't easy back then at the global stage. A lot of people wanted to, they argued that time is of essence. We don't have time to do randomized controlled trials. We should just, offer what's available and do compassionate use. And and the aftermath, we saw a lot of successes from that strategy. And the National Academy of Sciences did a very nice study also talking about the importance of strong science, rigorous science in supporting product development, especially in an emergency where time is of the essence. It still remains the most efficient and effective way to look for truths. And so I thought we were beyond that. And all of a sudden in this situation, we're here today where there's a proliferation of bad observational studies. There are people that are still using this argument of, time is of essence. And not to harp on this too much longer, but it's also interesting that we are, relied on the UK to do simple, pragmatic, randomized trials within the healthcare system to give us some answers that we needed to, because it took so long to be able to get organized stateside.
As a clinician, Lou, do you see things differently as a clinician, or is there general advice you have for practicing physicians as far as patient care goes, based on what you've seen?
Yeah, so I think that, so my point of view from any kind of policy perspective has always been like, at the bedside. That always was like a guiding post, like what matters at the bedside for patient care? What would I want for my patients? And, and I think that sometimes there's an urge to do things. We saw the hydroxychloroquine, for example, was avidly promoted. I think that we have to remember that the best care, especially in a time of uncertainty, is, the basic fundamental good medical care that we have to provide. Supportive care it wins every time over, untested experimental treatments. And it's important for them to be evaluated carefully in well-designed clinical trials, where it's able to detect the efficacy signal and the safety signals. I've been, and it's interesting that I still practice a little bit part-time. I have a clinic at Hopkins, and we went fully to telemedicine in the first few months, and now I'm going back to see patients in the clinic. And the telemedicine, it wasn't too smooth a transition, but I was surprised to see how many patients were eager and available and able to do it. I'll be And remember, my practice is like inner city Baltimore, a lot of, HIV infected patients, and they would be like, I have my vitals. I took my vitals with my home. They had their vital signs. I was like, oh, okay. I didn't expect you to have your vital signs and your blood pressure. So it was really interesting to society, was ready to take this on before the medical system had embraced it, likely because of reimbursement issues and other regulatory issues. So there's a silver lining in a way that I think, some changes that we've seen with the delivery of care are here to stay.
And sort of from the patient, there's a lot of interest. I know certainly from my family members. I'm a pharmacist, and so is my wife, and we field a lot of questions about the tests. And there's obviously more than one type. Can you comment a little bit about the physician's role, what you see as the different types of tests, what some of their strengths are, and then for clinical study implications? Can you touch on that a little bit as well?
Yeah, so the test has been a little bit of a wild west, right? And part of it, I think, really emphasized the importance of FDA and FDA regulatory authority. I think that the idea that FDA is not needed to be able to provide oversight, we saw that early on, didn't work too well. They had to rapidly revert that stance. I have to say, first of all, from the national level, we have relied on CDC over and over again to get us going. Every time there is emerging disease, whether it's the Zika or Ebola or other emerging infectious diseases, CDC jumps and starts developing diagnostic tests, and then they distribute them to the public health labs. So there's a lot of blame placed on CDC for where we are, but I actually can't blame them fully, because the fact is that even if they had developed a perfect test early on, they wouldn't have been able to scale it and distribute it at a commercial scale that a pandemic demanded. In 2009, there were a lot of flu tests in the market already that could be repurposed for H1N1. So we needed to rethink how we do diagnostic tests as we go forward. I think that today we still have the molecular-based tests, mostly PCR, to detect acute infection, and the antigen-based tests for acute infection as well, but they're much less sensitive. So a negative test still requires confirmation with a molecular-based test, and if the patient is deemed to be high risk for COVID disease. And then we have the antibody-based tests to detect exposure to past infection. The problem with the antibody-based test today, that it still remains more of an epidemiologic tool and a research tool, because we don't know what really confers protection, how long protection lasts. So it doesn't really lead to any action change on the part of the patient. If the test is negative, it doesn't really mean that they likely, if they had COVID, that they are susceptible, and if it's positive, doesn't mean that they are protected. And then I think of the interesting from the PCR-based test, though, is that the performance characteristics, the sensitivity of these tests are all over the place right now. And FDA developed reference panel for the manufacturers to validate against the common reference panel. And they are now gradually receiving data from these developers. And the initial finding is that the performance characteristics are much more varied than they would have anticipated. And they're likely going to publish that as soon as they have a certain number available to them. But I think it just shows also how hard it is to be able to compare products, that are not being put through the same process as they're being validated. As a pharmacist, USP, you're very aware of this issue. And, and this is not by diagnostic tests, but for vaccines, there is an effort to be able to use the same common reagents and processes to measure the immune response in the phase 3 trials, precisely because of this issue. We know that laboratory the validation processes and materials will impact the results and make direct comparisons impossible.
You talked about rate limiting factor early on, and this is a question one of the attendees had. What's the rate limiting factor now for scaling up these tests? Is that something that should be pursued? And what would be the role of a public-private relationship or a non-government organization to do the scaling up? Is that such a role that we should even explore?
Yeah, I mean, so let's be clear that the manufacturers did scale up and they had resolved the choke points. There are, supply chain issues. There are laboratory capacity issues. There are human capital issues. These people still have to be able to process these tests. They had done a really magnificent job in augmenting the available diagnostic test supply to America. Now, it was, again, another missed opportunity is not to recognize that the supply is not infinite, and that if the outbreak doesn't come under control, if you look at the curves, and it's quite dramatic, the second hump, if you will, because we never really contained the first, but there's no way that they could have continued to keep up with the number of cases that are occurring each day across the United States. With this widespread, this much disease, there's no surge capacity that can meet that demand. So I looking for different strategies. There is folks are looking to just today in the news that there are a consortium of 5 or 6 states that are going to come together and do a huge purchase for the antigen tests. They're still working out how they would be used. There's some talk about pool testing to be able to create efficiencies at the lab, but they require, they all have associated shortcomings. The labs themselves, they were fantastic in looking at different ways to run their tests, whether they could, use saline instead of more sophisticated reagents. And so there was a lot of troubleshooting in real time, but there's, again, a finite capacity.
Thank you. Maybe switch gears just a little bit, if I could, related to this. And you talk a little bit about your thoughts on therapeutics, including plasma, and how that fits in with any clinical studies.
Yeah, so that's, look, so let's say, today what we know is that NIH did a very nice study. The first one that they started to be launched was comparing remdesivir to supportive care. And they showed in this randomized controlled trial that remdesivir offered a benefit to patients with moderate to shortened duration of time to recovery. And then the UK recovery trial was able to show that dexamethasone also improved mortality in patients with severe disease and ventilatory support. Now, the NIH study is now looking at remdesivir in combination with a JAK1/3 inhibitor, baricitinib, and they're also, or by itself, so each by itself. And they finished enrollment, so we should know the results of this within a couple of weeks. And then they have selected a third agent to put into the study. So this is the classic, rigorous RCT. Very important fundamental clinical research to be done in a pandemic. So they're going to continue to explore. I believe that the next agent may be perhaps an interferon, because the immune system, the more we learn about the disease, the more the immune system seems to play a very significant role in pathogenesis and recovery. Now, the NIH also launched the active studies, and just this last week, they launched a suite of studies where they're going to study they're going to study monoclonal antibodies. The first one from Lilly, and they're going to do that as an outpatient setting. They're going to do that inpatient setting, and separately, the NIAID is doing studies in nursing home residents, as well as post-exposure prophylaxis in household contacts. So they're looking at all different potential scenarios for monoclonal antibodies. I personally think that it's likely going to be the next win, if you will, because of the good track record and very, great science being applied to developing those monoclonals by the companies that are playing a role: Regeneron, Lilly, Vir, and others. Then there is this issue of convalescent plasma, and frankly, it's a story. No, this one needs to go to the history of how not to manage potential therapeutics in a pandemic, because 55,000 individuals have been received convalescent plasma in the US, and we don't know if it works or it doesn't. Now, 55,000 individuals. Now, that's, in comparison to the NIH study that showed remdesivir to be effective, enrolled 1,000 patients. There's a huge push now for convalescent plasma. The data are not that compelling. I'm sure you can make a headline from any observational study. The Danish actually halted their study because they realized that most patients who were presenting for convalescent plasma had higher titers at presentation than the titers in the convalescent plasma that were being administered. And there's a tremendous difficulty in recruiting patients, now enrolling patients in the randomized controlled trials. NHLBI with NCATS is managing an RCT of convalescent plasma. And so they're trying to accelerate that to get to, again, the truth. And NIH is also launching hyperimmune globulin study to assess its potential utility by the end of August. Not only has this proliferation of convalescent plasma under expanded access really delays our understanding of the role that convalescent plasma plays or not, but it also made it really hard for the IVIG manufacturers to acquire source material to make IVIG. So that one I think needs to be, will be a story for the future, but right now there's a tremendous amount of hope, and it's very difficult to dissuade the public and treating physicians that we're still given an experimental therapy for which we really do not know whether our patients are being helped or harmed.
I had a follow-up question. I think you may have already answered it, but I'll ask, and maybe this is not necessarily just for COVID, but it could be for general infection diseases and other epidemics. What's the role, with RCT being the gold standard, what's the role of compassionate use information? I know that's something FDA explored at some point. With Ebola, with 4 or 5 patients, there was some extrapolation made and some decisions made, but is there a decision, do you think, that needs to be made there? Is there some generalization that can be made, or do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the PI, the principal investigator for the remdesivir study from the NIH, he lives in Nebraska. He's from UNMC. He had this quote that says, there's nothing compassionate about compassionate use. And I don't quite, I'm a big fan, but because he's an RCT evangelist, but I think there's a role for it, of course. But we have to really be very careful. You may remember, Sahil, like in the Ebola epidemic, that there was an infant that was born to a mother who had Ebola, and it was in an area for which there was no RCT. It was not a site for an RCT, and this child had 100% chance of mortality based on historical data. There was no way to transport a newborn infant, to a clinical trial site, and we made available drugs under compassionate use. She actually lived. She's been, she became like being cared for an aunt, and with Doctors Without Borders still follow her growth. It's a great story. Like, we want to be able to support access to investigational treatments when it makes sense, when there's no way to do so under an RCT. But the decision to do so needs to be really carefully undertaken. It cannot be, the way this was convalescent plasma push came about through op-eds and briefings at the White House before coalescing around clinical trial sites, planned protocols. That's what's worrisome, and that's what allowed the situation to get out of control, is to be able to have an expanded access program before plans for an RCT were in place. We need to make sure that we secure those programs before treating 55,000 individuals without knowing and not having a good answer.
Thank you, Lou. One of the attendees has a question. I think it relates to this. It's what are the key elements of facts that still need to be researched for coronavirus? Not necessarily treatment, where we focus, but basic science for viruses, for COVID. Where should we be focusing our energies?
Research. I'm sorry, I missed the first part of the question. Like the research focus.
Yeah. Exactly. What are the key elements or facts that still need research for coronavirus. It appears we're stressing treatment and diagnostic answers without knowing the basic science behind the virus.
Yeah, it does take a little while to be able to aggregate that. I think the science is actually moving quite quickly. I think we know, for example, that the immune response, we're learning more about just, have a big picture, basically that there is an immune system in disarray. There's a lot of inflammation, that you can have concomitant robust viral replication with a concomitant robust immune response. That's an ineffective immune response. We know that patients that sometimes present the sickest are the ones that have the highest levels of immune globulin. We know that there's a depletion of interferon, and sometimes, so these are all things that have been learned. Like every day, there's something new that comes about. I think that there was a lot of push early on for the immune modulators, the IL-6. And thankfully, they were done under RCTs. These companies, they Regeneron did the studies, and we were able to very good studies, and identify that they were unfortunately not working. But I think that goes to show that now we know why they didn't work, right? It's not just one immunomodulator that was playing a role. It's a broader dysregulation. It may also explain why dexamethasone worked. I think that it just goes to show, I think, the importance of having good trials, that, the efficiencies, the quality of information that you can get out of a good trial before you have worked out all the basic science around the new virus. It just makes that the importance of doing the robust trials even more important, precisely because we have very little information about what's really happening at that molecular level at the onset. So I think that characterizing the immune response and understanding also host factors that are affecting that immune response are going to be really helpful. And we may actually have vaccines before we completely elucidate that. And I'll just give credit to the FDA for, for CBER staff, that there was a lot of push for allowing vaccines to be developed based on immunogenicity endpoints. And they insisted on, meaningful endpoints. So they're going to ask these vaccine developers to demonstrate that the vaccines are actually preventing infection or disease and not just eliciting an immune response. Again, precisely because there's so much that we don't fully understand about the immune response associated with this virus and what's needed to protect.
Obviously, FDA, NIH, CDC, other .govs have put a lot of effort, energy into this. But can you talk from your experience? There's a lot of information coming out during a pandemic, during an epidemic. How does the information globally come together? Where does that occur? What does that look like? That's something probably a lot of people on the call are interested in. From your perspective, where does all that information come together? How do you distill? How do you pick the ones that are more relevant? And what does the flow of information look like? And how does that impact decision-making in studies? I know it's a lot.
It is a lot. I think that that's something that I actually found it to be really, it's really amazing how the U.S. government has for being so vast, is so organized. And I think, we all playing different roles and responsibilities in the federal government. I think it's really easy to marvel at this at times. Like I can ask Lisa, for example, whether she can shake her head yes or no, like being chief of staff at the FDA, how things actually, there's a flow of information that is pretty well established. And it is important. And I think that, again, this time around, it doesn't seem to have happened. The government is not as organized as it has been historically. So we have the departments at the executive branch, the departments and agencies that will flow to the HHS, for example, so FDA, CDC, NIH, it will actually flow to HHS. Secretary usually would have at least once a day meetings with the senior staff around emergent issues and tee up the things that needed to be resolved. And of course, there'll be an information shared with the White House, usually the National Security Council, because they are the most kind of bureaucratically organized to coordinate the response from the White House, but it includes Domestic Policy Council and other players as well. And again, the White House, there's a system in place to make sure information is shared in an organized fashion. And at the international level, the US government would be very, very present with the World Health Organization. And again, there would be another international forum for these discussions to take place in an organized and coordinated manner. It didn't happen, right? It's not happening. So I was there, I was at the NSC during the Ebola epidemic in the DRC 2016, 2017. Not only we had several daily meetings with interagency partners, but once a week there would be the USG-wide meeting where all the key departments and agencies would call in. Sometimes there'll be 150 participants in those calls, but it was meant to level set, and each department will do a brief out of the pertinent issues. So CDC would brief, the DoD would brief, State Department would brief on their efforts. And it's remarkable to think about how we can have, and there'll be, of course, a situation report that would be shared with the partners across government. So it is an organized, a formidable structure that we have in this system that we have of government. It's undisciplined today. It's quite undisciplined.
Thank you, Lou. I'm going to switch gears just a little bit. There were some questions that are, I think, more appropriate for, these are sort of for the patient focus. This is, and we can come back to this. I know there's a queue of questions accumulating as well, but can you talk a little bit about the vaccine that's come, what your thoughts are on the vaccine? What's the likelihood? What's the timeline? What would it look like? And then from a patient perspective, when I'm going to my physician, should I be asking for the antibody test? Is there something else that I need to be aware of?
Okay, let me get this one out of the way first, the antibody test, because I came to realize that we are like data. We love data. I'm wearing like my Apple Watch and my Whoop that measures like everything possible, and I don't know that it really changes my the action. The antibody is the same thing. I mean, it really will not, as long as you understand, it will not change. It should not change anything you do differently. If you have a positive test, it's a curiosity. It's like, okay, it's positive. It would not permit somebody to say, I do not need to take the precautions. And a negative test would just leave you very frustrated, I think, if you believe that you've been exposed. There have been instances where I ordered one for a patient of mine who works as a nurse in an emergency department, and I felt that if the test was, she was very, very concerned, and if the test was one, I canceled her, But again, I don't think that it really allows for any significant departure of the precautions that we have to take on today. For the vaccines, I think it's a really exciting story. I mean, the pathway is not simple, but I think it's really exciting that we show how government and private industry can come together and very quickly mobilize. It's not perfect, It would have been ideal for us to do a common clinical trial, like the Solidarity trial that the WHO is launching. The vaccine manufacturers did not want to do it that way. Pfizer's doing its own trial. But nevertheless, we have about 6 or 7 contenders that have a very broad portfolio of technologies. Some of them have been untested before, but they represent years of US government investments in those technologies. The gene-based vaccines came out of DARPA. So it really is like amazing to see some of these radical thoughts at the time. They're just radical thoughts into actually a product, right? And what it takes. So I'm excited about that, it can be done. I personally am very biased towards the protein-based vaccines that Novavax and now Sanofi are engaged in developing. And Novavax was yesterday or 2 days ago, they did the phase 1 readout, really very nice. phase 1 studies read out with high levels of neutralizing antibodies, T cell immune response, sterilizing immunity in non-human primates. Very exciting data. And we'll see whether Moderna and Pfizer will perform in clinical studies. I'm really excited to see that we're going to do the 30,000 people randomized controlled studies for each of those vaccines. So 15,000 to get placebo, 15,000 to get the active vaccine. The timing of when will we know? Well, depends on how fast they can enroll, depends on the attack rate in the community that is being, the population of the study, and it depends on how effective the vaccine really is. The DSMB is likely going to look at the data after 50 cases in the study population. And so it's possible that we'll know, I think likely before the end of the year, we'll have a good information on the short-term safety and efficacy of some of these vaccines. We will not have long-term safety and will not know duration of immunity. So safety surveillance is going to be really critical. And as it was done during 2009 pandemic, the US government coordinated a very robust CDC and FDA especially safety surveillance systems. And the rollout is going to be complicated because these vaccines are not mix and match. If they're likely more than most of them are going to be 2 doses. So if you come back later for the second vaccine, it needs to be the same one. The distribution is going to be really complicated. And I'm concerned that CDC may be sidelined in this process. So I don't expect vaccine for broad use until well into 2021, but we should see, some vaccine around early 2021.
Can you make a educated guess on the duration of the immune response?
Yeah, so I think that it'll depend on the vaccine. I think that the protein subunit vaccines are going to last longer than my educated guess. I think given what we know about corona, what's really hard, I think, is that for coronaviruses, we know that immunity tends to wane over time, but it doesn't mean that even upon reinfection that the disease will manifest in the same severe form. So I think that duration of immunity is something relative. Like if if the immunity wanes, but the person is not predisposed to having such a severe outcome as the original infection, that's a win. Is that a wane in immunity? I'm not sure if that's would be defined as wane in immunity. So we'll have to look at it. I think it's important to measure what matters. And, at the end of the day, patients don't say, my God, my vaccine generated a very nice immune response. What they really want is this vaccine protected me from getting really sick. And we have to measure what matters.
So with fall around the corner and flu season possibly right around the corner, how does that complicate everything we just talked about?
Yeah, I don't know for sure what's going to happen. And I would like to have, I know early on I was thinking we're going to have this under control. And as a bonus, we won't have flu season because we're going to be, we're going to be eliciting the misanthropes in us and not really being with other people too much. And because we're not socializing, there's less opportunity for flu. But it's not what we're seeing. We're seeing that there are parties at the Hamptons, there are parties in boats, there are parties in the beach, and that's what we're seeing. And so I think we're going to end up seeing a lot of the duress and the stress from social distancing that are going to be maintained for a protracted period of time by people that are careful. So there's the unintended consequences, social isolation and all. But then we're not going to have all the benefits of that because a lot of people are still going to be socializing and not protecting themselves. So I think we're going to end up with a pretty messy flu season. And I think it'll be important to seek vaccination to those who, I think vaccination, will help. And in the absence of properly available diagnostic tests, I would hope that people be able to access antiviral medication for flu, regardless of whether they have a confirmed test or not, given the predicament that for some people, having dual co-infection might pose and health risks. So, we have the tools, it's how we deploy them.
As a clinician, as someone in your former roles, and as a parent, what are your thoughts on school opening, colleges opening? What are the different scenarios that you could foresee, and what are your recommendations?
Yeah. It's so hard. I think that in a way, I think this, I can say, I think for us, all of us, involved here, we've been very fortunate that we have, for the most part, jobs that are amenable to telework. And if the Alumni Association, I think most of us have grown kids, if we have kids. So I think it's really hard for people that can't do that, that really have to care, that they need they just have to get out of the house for their work, or they have very small kids. That's about 44% of the workforce at In-Q-Tel. Small kids at home, I think it's a real impediment. On the other hand, I don't see how we're going to be able to reopen given how much activity, viral activity there is in communities across the US. And also, what we're learning from Israel experience, where they thought they had it under control. They reopened schools very quickly. It really circulated very rapidly in schools, and then it went back to families and communities. Summer camp, MMWR published a report this last week also on how fast it spreads. And this yo-yo is no help, right? Again, the yo-yo creates uncertainty, anxiety, it creates instability. So I think we need to find a path and stick to it. And I think most schools, I think, are now saying that they're going to be online only for the first semester, which is very prudent. And I think it will allow people to kind of optimize their situation based on a suboptimal scenario. I just can't see it making work. Teachers are not going to put up with it. And it takes a lot of planning to be able to do this safely. Smaller classroom sizes and masks wearing, distance, keeping the kids apart. They haven't resolved the school bus issue and transport. So I think that given the scenario, I think we ought to figure out how we can make it work online and put the resources that way.
Before we go to the questions, I have two more questions. One is, do you have advice from a physician perspective related to COVID for different populations, whether it's immune compromised, different older age, there are a lot of people that are on this call that may be interested from a personal perspective, sort of, what do I do to take care of myself? How do I take care of my family? And balancing mental health, physical health, and obviously the infection. Then I'll queue up the second question as well. Do you have any other recommendations, any other learnings that you want to share with the group before we go to the Q&A session?
So I think that, I think there's a lot of information that has been disseminated around face masks and social distancing of like 6 feet, the 6 feet apart. But I think one area that has not been stressed is like that minimize the number of encounters. Just minimizing, is probably significantly helps as well. I think that in terms of lessons learned, I think we know that there are elements of any response. We're in the age of epidemics, and some things we're going to have to get it right. Before we put the 5th countermeasure for anthrax in the stockpile, we need to get those fundamentals right. So diagnostic testing, and how are we going to do contact tracing at scale? How are we going to support social distancing at a societal level, minimal disruption? How do we do the randomized controlled trials in a pragmatic setting? I think that the way we do it today, repurposing the infrastructure we have, is fine, but how do we really leverage 21st century technology, electronic health records, mega healthcare systems to be able to do more of this real world evidence, but in a way that is actually interventional randomized trials, so we can really fully leverage the technologies to put it to service, in a pandemic, so we can find things that help either medical strategies or new countermeasures. How do we do that? I think we have to figure that out, and the opportunities to do that. I think that you really highlighted a very important point that everybody's risk is different and who they live with is different, and some things that may be reasonable risks for one individual may not be reasonable for others. A lot has been said about airplanes and travel. I think it can be done safely for the most part. We know that the airlines have really changed how they do things. They've been doing that for the last several years. They just basically ramped it up and are doing more to communicate. Some are doing better than others. But the feared air exchange, like we say, the air is not fresh, but it's clean. The airplane air, and it's the airport transit that really poses the greatest risk. They're trying to change the more touchless experience. There are ways to do this safely, but nothing is foolproof. And for some individuals that are immunocompromised, have comorbid conditions, are of advanced age, it just may not be practical or reasonable to take those risks. It's a personal choice at the end of the day.
Thank you. Thank you. Clearly you see a potential for significant change to medical care and infrastructure in the US, if not the world, right around the corner. At least you're asking for it.
I'd love to see that.
Angela, do you want to go through the questions? I've only seen 3, but you may have gotten a few others.
Yeah, there's one here. How can we assure a diverse population will be included in clinical trials? And is that something manufacturers will consider?
Yeah, so I think that this is an issue that the FDA is like between a hard and a rock place, because everybody understands that the importance of having a diverse population in clinical studies, yet they're not in a position to not act on the data they may have. So if they have a very homogeneous population in a clinical study, but very robust safety and efficacy data, I don't think FDA is going to be able to say, reject the data, until you do it better. I think, it is important for the manufacturers to do their job and try to enroll diverse populations in the clinical studies. I don't see how they can get away with it from a societal level this day and age, from a scientific level as well.
Let's see. We hear about many of these testing issues here in the United States. Would you be able to comment on how we should interpret numbers related to positive cases in other countries that are reported, such as like in the Hopkins dashboard? How do we accept these numbers as realistic snapshots?
Yeah, I don't think we necessarily can accept numbers from every country that we're seeing. We know that some countries are not going to be forthcoming with their numbers. Some countries would like to be forthcoming, but they don't have the diagnostic testing capacity. And so there's no way to really know for sure. And including our numbers, we know that they are, drastically under an underestimate of the true burden of the epidemic.
Let's see. One other one. Given the FDA 60-day filing review clock and the 8-month CBER review time, the recruitment of NIH 30,000 subjects for substantial proof of efficacy, can patients really have an approved vaccine on pharmacy shelves by the end of 2021, or when?
Yeah, so I don't think that FDA is planning to circumvent the approval process, but I think what they can use is make use of the emergency authorization. And so CBER staff has been very, very clear about what they would like to see before a vaccine is administered outside of a clinical study under an EUA or expanded access. And they want to see data from randomized controlled studies that demonstrate the vaccine is sufficiently safe and that it prevents disease. The guidance is out there. It's been implemented in the clinical studies. Now, if the EUA is issued on that basis, I think that they will take their time to be able to, before they actually approve a vaccine. They will want to have longer term safety data. They want to have understand the duration of immunity. They'll have to have all the CMC issues addressed. Remember that the vaccines are going to be manufactured in for the most part. So either the companies have their own agreements, or they're going to rely on the advanced development manufacturing sites that the US government partnered with years ago at Texas A&M University, as well as by Emergent Biosolutions. So these are not the facilities that are going to make the vaccine forever, I don't think. They're making the supply that is needed for the emergency. So I think there's a lot that will need to be sorted out before these vaccines are actually licensed.
I have a follow-up, Lou. Not necessarily for COVID, but in the past, I'm sure you've run into this. How do you balance or decide EUA versus depleting stock for an actual clinical study? How do you balance the two against each other?
Yeah, so I think that the clinical study takes precedence. You may remember that once the RCTs were available for the Ebola therapeutics in 2014, that we stopped there was very limited supply of the drugs, and there was no use, no compassionate access outside of the clinical studies. I think that clinical studies, generation of evidence takes precedence. But I don't know that we're going to have a supply issue, given that manufacturing is being scaled up at financial risk. So it may end with more vaccine than we could responsibly use in the short term.
Thank you.
Would you send your 20-year off to college?
I don't know that I could stop them. I think that it's complicated. It's a very personal decision, and really, it depends on their risk factors and whether they understand that they are contributing to, if they don't take responsible actions, they're contributing to a real significant crisis in the country and the world. Not an easy answer.
Just going through, I think that, let's see. You said that the convalescent antibody therapy has been given to 55,000 people without having a study having been done. What went wrong that allowed this to occur? Were these 55,000 treated under emergency INDs or under practice of medicine? What could have been done to get a study before that actually happened?
Yeah, well, I don't know that, there's plenty of blame to go around, I would say, but there's several factors that drove this. One, FDA, I think tried to be flexible and allowed an expanded access program to be launched before there were more guarantees that that we could stand up a study. And if you talk to the folks at Mayo who are managing the EAP, they said they never imagined that this is going to mushroom into a 50. They thought they're going to stop, just get this started until the RCT. But these are lessons that we know from history. We lived through these before. What happens when you have an EAP without thinking through carefully about the implications for the clinical study. And I have to say that this is very influential. This is a very dangerous combination. Very charismatic, influential, persuasive scientists from reputable academic institutions that can really make a strong case for a trajectory, however misguided it may be, and that's a situation we are facing as a nation. I think we're now waiting for either the NIH studies to be completed or the UK to give us the answers that we need.
Let's see, I think one more just came in, and then we can go ahead and wrap it up. Do you think a viable vaccine distribution system will be in place when there is a vaccine or vaccines ready for use? I mean, you kind of touched on that earlier, but related to the actual distribution system.
Yeah. I like to think there will be, but I don't know. And one of the concerns I have is whether the public would be ready to accept, a vaccine in the absence of a strong public health trust in public health leaders. Right now, we have Dr. Fauci as the main spokesperson, and even him has really been challenged because of this anti-science sentiment that exists. So I think it'll be a real challenge. And one thing that worries me too is that everything is just ethically so fraught. So one of the populations that are being discussed as an early vaccine to be vaccinated is prisoners, for example, in congregate settings. Like, you couldn't think about a more challenging ethical dilemma. And we know that the first vaccines to come out of the pipeline are going to be the vaccines that have never been really truly tested. As Moderna, like, is way ahead of the pack. In a way, I wish that the Sanofis and the Mercks and the J&Js would be ahead of the pack, and not the newbie, because you can see how this can be really a complicated path to say that these are the least vaccines for technology we're least familiar with, and these are going to be the first ones out there for the most vulnerable populations, whether it's healthcare workers, nursing home residents, prisoners. So I think this needs to be really carefully considered. And at this point in time, we haven't decided on a trajectory about how the decisions are going to be made, whether ACIP and the National Academy of Sciences and the rule of VRBPAC. It's just very undefined right now.
Angela, Lisa, did you want to close the meeting out? I want to say, do really appreciate you taking time to be the first speaker. It was really great to talk to you again, and thank you for sharing all your thoughts. I'm sure there'll be more of these presentations coming out for the Alumni Association. This will be obviously hard to compete with.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm sorry it's such a gloomy topic, but we will get over this. It will, it will end. It will.
Yes, and I just want to jump in here and again say thank you so much to Lou and to Sohail, and of course to Angela for supporting us always. We are very excited to be able to host this. We've been talking for a while about finding a mechanism where we could draw people in across the country, and we may have now found it. So very excited. Thank you so much for this wonderful, substantive, really timely presentation. If folks have feedback that they'd like to give or ideas for future events, Angela and I would love to hear that, and we will discuss them among the Activities Committee group. But again, heartfelt thanks to our speakers, and have a great day. Take care.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.